Sounds good.
Sorry, Scott H, not Scott S. I forgot about that.
Yeah, we got it. So am I Stern now? Should we just go with that?
That's right. I don't know. So this is the internal customer call for August 2021. Right now, we don't have any internal customers on the call, although we could all call ourselves internal customers because we use our tools too. I'm going to start with intros just to let the folks who are new here introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Alana?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Alana Bellucci. It's like my 6th week at GitLab, and I'm the product manager for Monitor. So nice to meet you all. I'm hoping to do a similar type of conversation with internal customers for Monitor.
And Scott Stern, why don't you introduce yourself too?
Thanks. Hey everyone, I'm Scott. I'm doing an internship for learning under James for the product management role. Yeah, glad to be here.
Welcome. Always nice to see new faces. I'm going to jump in. The roadmap deck, rather, got a couple of updates. Group testing is now the DRI for review apps. That came over to us from the release team. I'm really excited about the potential direction there of incorporating more of our features into review apps, making review apps easier to use. And then we're wrapping up our handoff of code quality over to static analysis. Now that the code quality inline annotations are shipped, we were just wrapping up a couple of things. Miranda was working on some front end stuff and making sure that display in the merge request widget when there is data available from both of the branches is showing up correctly, or we're properly showing what the error is and why there's no data there. That's kind of what we're wrapping up. I know Drew helped out with a ton of documentation around dealing with dependency proxy and getting around some of those Docker Hub limits that we were running into and customers were running into as they were having to download those code quality or code climate images over and over. So Drew, appreciate you jumping in and doing that. So the topic that I had proposed was review apps. And Kyle, you got started with the topic there. So why don't you jump in and tell us how we're using review apps internally to start, and then take that conversation wherever you want to.
Okay. Good to meet you, Alana and Scott, and good to interact with you again. Good to see everybody. So yeah, thanks for the prompt in the engineering productivity channel. That kind of gave me a little nudge to be like, let's maybe have some things in the doc to spur some conversation. I just want to detail like the primary usages of review apps that I see internally. So we have like self-contained projects like docs or gitlab.com, where review apps are straightforward to deploy. It's like a build and maybe static site or mostly static site. And review apps are really handy to enable like cheap exploratory testing. And then more challenging projects like the GitLab single repo, where we have to build the image inside the pipeline and deployment, which is like a tedious process, like a complex and tedious process that has cluster management complications and cost management complications. I kind of noted an issue that I have for discussion around maybe changing how we use review apps internally to make them ephemeral by default. So they are used to support testing and then they disappear. And if someone wants to keep them around like 24/7 as they are now, make that functionality available on demand. So before I go into my question, those are the two usages for review apps that I'm aware of. Any questions on those that I can help?
I just want to make sure that I'm clear. We, by default, have review apps available for Handbook, for www, for, I guess, for the self-contained projects that you described. But for the monorepo for gitlab.org/GitLab, that doesn't come with a review app out of the box. So if I open an MR and commit, I'm not going to get a review app that would spin up a review app for a GitLab instance.
Not all changes would. So front end changes and then end-to-end spec changes or CI, like there's some set of file changes where you will have a review app available along with your change. The review deploy, like the review app jobs, are available in the pipeline, for the other, like a backend change if you want it. And you can play those jobs manually, but they don't run by default.
Okay. Gotcha. Cool.
There are other projects that I am leaving off here that use review apps. So
Oh, yeah.
I want to be really clear. It's not 3 projects. There are lots of other ones. And I just more wanted to focus in on use cases where there's simple review app deploy processes that are very straightforward. And then there's more complex ones where things are a little more tedious.
I appreciate you reducing that to just 2 use cases for us.
And I would say internal use, like customers, I'm sure have a lot more too.
Oh, yeah.
So the question that came to mind as you're taking this on is, I've been thinking a lot on how we can provide more context in MRs. Like one example would be maybe related to performance regressions, where we could use a baseline set of performance data that would run against the review app environment and then test the MR against those same, like that same performance test, and look where there's deviations to that baseline. And it got me thinking, how do you see the other features within testing evolving to, like, in conjunction with review apps?
We can do the first one today. Browser performance testing and accessibility testing can both run against a review app, and the merge request widgets will show that deviation. I think that there's huge improvements that we can make in those, and making that process easier of saying, I want to do this test and I want to do it against a review app could be better as well. I've long thought that there's also opportunity to run that comparison, like see that comparison against what it looks like in production. So yeah, it might change in my review app, MR to MR, but how does it look compared to what's going on in production from a browser performance standpoint? So starting to pull that data back in. I think there's also something interesting about, you can request a code review. I want to request a user acceptance review. So somebody can push a change, it goes up. For me, the use case is release post, because it's release post week. And when it's time for a product manager or a tech writer, whoever it is, to do that change, they get a ping, but that ping includes not just the MR, but the link directly to the review app, so that they can go in and look at that change directly in the review app, leave the comments through visual review tools, or make the edits within the review app itself, or the suggestions, and then kind of make that process just a little bit easier. I think that we're right on the cusp of being able to do that with a lot of the tech that we have and a lot of the feature set that we have, to make that experience really radically different. The other one then, as I'm thinking about my use case, because I'm always thinking about my use case as a product manager when it comes to review apps, very selfishly, is how do I go to user acceptance testing, and what do I need to go test? So if a developer can do the same sort of thing of give me a user acceptance, like have that be a request type where it sends me the review app and it sends me a checklist to test or requirements to test. And that even incorporates our testing requirements feature set. And I can check those off as I go. Doing that UAT when it's in that pre-merge state, the MR isn't yet merged into default, or the feature branch is still sitting there. That for me is a really compelling use case. But again, it's selfishly as a product manager. So that's at least my initial thoughts, but I'd love to hear from the team. What are you thinking as we take on this new category? And preemptive thanks to Joanna for keeping track of notes for us, as always. Missed you.
One obvious one, maybe to us as testing, was our failed visual review tools that we didn't really get off the ground very well. If for those that are not aware, we created a feature called visual review tools. It's kind of a separate app. The user can add a script to their build. So when a review app comes up, they're viewing their app, we have a little icon at the bottom. They can just make comments straight from the review app, and it'll go directly on the merge request. The goal was to be able to take like screenshots and be able to more easily show bugs straight from the review app and go directly to the MR. We had some issues with authentication and how to more easily mount these tools onto your review app rather than having to paste the script straight onto your HTML. So there are some things that we can investigate here now that we have more control over review apps. How can we package this more easily? Is there a way to authenticate more easily within review apps when we're creating them?
James, going back to one thing you said about pulling data from like production for that performance, this may be a minority of use case, but like our review app environment doesn't align from a capacity or performance perspective with production. So that's where I was really talking about like a review app performance baseline, where we're kind of comparing it to something that's a similarly scoped app and then look for deviations against that.
I think that's interesting. I wonder, because there's always that drift, and not even drift, there's always huge difference between potentially your production environment and your staging environment, where we might have one database cluster or one database machine that's running for all of staging, and we have 3 clusters in its HA in production. And we find that in staging, database is a bottleneck. We never experience it in production. Like, do we want to, and we can, and push that problem out to the user that you understand your architecture and we're not going to try to make assumptions about it. But for me, that's probably the blocker of why I wouldn't want to use that feature. Like, yeah, of course I know that there's problems in staging. Or do we limit it just to, hey, front end is front end is front end, or it's browser side? Are you seeing the same browser side problems that you would somewhere else? And can we start to give you capabilities to spin up different browsers? And that's where that gets really interesting. So you can start to do more of that kind of testing when you're in your feature branch development versus it's built, it's deployed out to staging, it's 2 weeks later, and now we're finding bugs in IE6 or whatever.
Yeah.
And tell me more though about that difference and how that is valuable to you, because I'm making assumptions it's like there's problems in that.
Yeah.
Just prove me.
Yeah, so like I guess the way I look at it is an indication that a transaction is taking longer compared to the like environment is much more helpful than comparing against like a different environment. And versus saying always set up your review apps just like your production environment for all of your MRs, like that would be very that would cost a lot of money for the single repo, because the intent, and that kind of tied into my discussion issue up above, the intent is that review apps are either available 24/7 so that anyone can go in and click the review app link and go in and access it, or it can spin up very quickly. Both of those things are, I'll say like spinning up very quickly is not something we've been able to figure out in the mono repo. And then Scott, what you're talking about with authentication challenges, I see that like, again, looking at the single repo, that's almost like a challenge that we would have on the app of trying to figure out how do we like integrate our review app implementation so that things can be like the handbook. So like when you make a handbook change, you can click the review app link and it takes you right to the page because there's no authentication needed to get to that page. Whereas on like a GitLab instance, you'd need data, you'd need a number of things just to even get to that point where it's, hey, I changed the way the issues page list looks. Go look at it. You know, it's an app level challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge barrier to why I think a lot of engineers just don't use review apps for the mono repo.
Yeah. Well, and there's no data. Like the thing that sucks
it's just
is
like
you're a blank slate.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's a lot of times if I want to test someone's MR, I'm just going to pull it down and test it locally because I have data.
Yeah, or Gitpod, which can use the data seeding from GDK. So
the review apps can't use the data seeding.
You can in a very convoluted way. So like the way that we have to do it is you have to connect to the like Rails console instance and run like a command. But to get connected to that Rails constants or the Rails console, like the task runner, I think it's called Toolbox now. to get connected to that pod, you have to have level of access. It's just
Yeah, you
way
have-
more friction than get pod.
Okay. Yeah.
Another thing, so James, this was something really more end-to-end testing, and again, hyper focused on our use case. We kind of talked about this a bit yesterday, is bringing more intelligence to the MRs. And this might be where the feature that you have of this test failed X number of times in the master branch in the last 14 days. We could look at end-to-end test failures against the review app, compare it to that baseline and say, hey, this test failed and it hasn't failed in master for the last 14 days. It may be something you want to look at. Because I think I would imagine the same thing with performance, like deviations from a baseline. There's going to be a lot of noise. And how do you tune that signal to noise ratio of these are the most actionable things from either performance testing, end-to-end testing, anything that you're doing against the live environment. Joanna, do you have anything maybe to pile on here too?
No, I think you covered our case pretty well.
Okay. I like what you're talking about with visual regression testing though. Like that would be really cool.
Yeah,
And
I
James,
think
I think
automated visual
ahead.
regression testing is something that Brandon opened or Brendan opened like 3 years ago. There's an issue floating around for that. Like there's a lot of really great ideas in both the review app backlog and the visual review tools backlog that we just have to have the capacity to jump into and get on. Data seeding seems like an interesting problem to go tackle. If that's one of the things that blocks you from quickly spinning up an instance, is having that data available and better understanding for the second use case of more for the single or the modern repo for the GitLab app, what blocks us from spinning up those review apps more readily. And like, is there a TTL that we need to create so that they're automatically shutting themselves back down for cost reasons, things like that.
Totally agree. I look at those as like implementation choices on our usage of review apps mostly. But if there is accelerators in the feature that you can build in, I just think how review apps are hosted. So like the examples I listed above, like I think docs and GitLab.com shove stuff to like a GCS bucket and then set up a route. So it's just static site hosting. Whereas we have like a Helm deployed app with like 15 different pods for every single review app. It's like on a Kubernetes cluster that's running 60 to 90 different versions of GitLab simultaneously. Like there's a completely different challenge.
Yeah,
on that.
Cool. Do you want to keep going down the review app path a little bit, or do you want to put a pin in that? Let's talk a little bit more about the plan for the test suite and the spec pass fail rate functionality.
Yeah, I think putting a pin in it. The thing I'm excited for is how to make more actionable information come out of review app related testing.
Yeah, I will probably follow up with you later about the main browser performance testing and how we can start to incorporate that and look at that drift, see what that's like. Cool. All right, so Kyle, you had put in a question about what functionality is available or planned for test suite and spec pass fail rate over time. For instance, the past 14 days. We did get the MVC that you talked about out a while ago, so you can always see how often has a test passed, or how often has it failed rather in the last 14 days. That's definitely an MVC. We haven't heard much for feedback, either positive or negative. But for us, the next logical step is probably, we already have a design done and we've thought through some of the backend components around how do we show just the last 12 or 10, I don't remember what the exact number was, executions of the test, again, on the default branch, and showing that full report so that you can start to see a trend over time. I think we've done some of the back end work. Eric's looking at me a little bit like I'm crazy because he probably would have been the one who did that. But for us, that's the next logical step, going down that path of here's a richer report so that you can start to dig in and understand when did that test start failing, what might have changed there, what else failed at the same time. so that as a manager or a lead, you can start to figure out where do we need to focus.
I realized didn't add this in the original question, but I did add like I'll say like a quality engineering focus. It's an ask to help with our internal reliability efforts, where we can start to better understand our end-to-end test health over time. That has a lot more specific details. So for feedback on the test fail the last 14 days, I love it. I feel like I said this before, but it's really helpful for master stability in particular. There was an order dependent failure earlier today where I was like, how often has this failed in master? Test report was the first place I looked, and it was higher than I thought. So it's a helpful thing, but I think it's buried. So knowing that it's there and then navigating to it, it's always like a 10-click, go to the pipeline, click on the test report, go to the suite, view the, click on the suite, wait for it to load, view the details of the spec that you're talking about. And none of those have unique links beyond the test report. So like sharing it with someone, I have to share a screenshot of it because I can't send them even a link to the suite. And if that doesn't, I can walk through exactly what I just talked about if my description isn't good enough here too.
Your description is great, but I'm sure that I would love to see the next time you start down that path, if you do a quick zoom and record and share it with us. We'd love to actually see how many clicks. I'm sure our new UX designer would love to see that too.
Okay. I'll link to the comment that I just did earlier today on this. So
perfect. Thank you.
And then I'll record a video when I can tomorrow and just be like, hey, this happened. Let's diagnose how I handle this from a master stability perspective. And I might also get some tips where it's like, you don't have to, here's 2 clicks that you can save.
Yeah, I would say it's really helpful for our pipeline triage as well, just to get an initial idea of, is this something that has been failing for a while, and then maybe we don't immediately jump into investigation on that, whereas a new failure, there's a higher possibility that it's a bug, so we can focus our efforts there and then come back to the tests that have been failing for a while.
Yeah, it's a useful way to inform urgency for sure.
I think that deep URL, what you're saying is you can't really share a URL, a direct URL for the failures, right? I think that's a fairly quick win that we could put in place.
Yeah, even just to the suite, right? So in the comment I linked to the overall test report, and how I got there is build failure, click on the pipeline, go to test report. But if you could go into our spec unit PG12 and just link to that, that's great. Just that one level would be super beneficial. But I'll get a recording.
Cool.
That's an easy thing.
And then looking at the issue that you shared for context, getting health of a QA test suite over time. As I'm looking at this, it kind of looks like the same data that we want to surface in the project quality summary, but trended over time. So here's how many tests passed, failed, skipped. And then you can apply, once you have that data, a health measure to it at some point.
Yep, exactly. And I think in the original ask, it was at the suite level, so the combination of tests, but even at the test level, how often is this test passing and failing over time? Okay. They don't, the suite it would be awesome.
Kyle, I had a quick question for the recording of the test that's failed. I'm not sure the implementation of that, but over time, does re-architecture affect that reference?
Good. Well,
if someone's like, hey, rename this because you have a spelling mistake, and then I go in, is that going to affect long-term data?
that might be a better question for the team, but I imagine like it's an immutable reference to the report at that point in time. So like if I generate a report today and it's named ABC123 and
Mhm.
they're like, oh no, it needs to be 234 tomorrow. I think the data is recorded today in a point where it's the current reference.
Okay.
Yeah, there'd be some implementation details that we need to work out, but how we build the URL based on the report. But yeah, hopefully it's a permanent URL rather than relative based on what is currently the architecture.
Cool. Thank you.
James, you mentioned the like the quality, I think you said quality management report. Is that in the deck and somewhere that maybe I'm just overlooking, or is there an epic for this?
It is in the deck.
That's all you need to say. I will go find
the
it
deck.
and ask you if I can't. Okay.
It's in the now, next, later as next. It should
Okay.
link you directly to the epic and you can see the data there. And we'll work on an endpoint that should get you the data if you want to pull it yourself. Cool. With that, I'm going to have to drop, but I'm going to try to not just end the call and hand it over to Scott, Scott Hampton, that is. Thank you, Scott. Thanks, everybody. This has been great for me. I hope the great conversation continues. Cheers.
Thanks.
I was just making sure that we stayed on the call. All right. Do we have more on the test report stuff to discuss, or we want to go to the next point?
Yeah, that's all great. Thank you so much.
Okay. I think Kyle, you have the next point in the agenda.
Yeah. What's on the roadmap for functionality to reduce CI minute usage by testing smarter? That's like a better question than what I started with, if anyone was following the Slack threads that James had.
Got it. So you're asking like, so you have a test report and we want to make the pipeline run faster and generate the test report faster or something, or?
Well, so like we run 184,000 tests every time we run a pipeline across front end and back end. We are embarking on a project to make that number much less, to save the number of pipeline minutes per pipeline that the single repo has. By like in Ruby, we're using dynamic spec analysis to say these files relate to these specs. Let's only run those prior to approval. And I know the workflow and things are a little not optimal. So like, I see the challenges with all of this, but we're trying. And we're doing something similar with Jest. I was wondering if you all are looking towards how can we enable customers to do something similar for common testing practices? Just like we're doing with Ruby and Jest. I look at it almost as the potential of a mode where you can say, run selective tests on merge requests up until this point in the merge requests. That point could be first approval, merge when pipeline succeeds, or merge train, but essentially running a limited pipeline to consume less minutes and defer that full feedback to later in the process.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm stepping out my element here. I'm not sure if we have anything on the roadmap currently to solve that, but I think that's a very useful feature to look into. Drew, it looks like you want to have something to say, or I don't know, you're leaning back like.
So I think yesterday had this talk to someone customer facing. I can't remember the role, but they were talking about how they were asking about how we support parallelism in test execution versus actions. No, Circle CI. And so, and the question was phrased as like, oh, they have this thing built in that just does it. Do we have a built-in thing like that? And when I looked at the way we implemented it and the way that Circle CI implemented it, it was the same thing. Like all the concepts under the hood worked exactly the same way. but theirs was packaged up in a way that made it feel automatic. And ours is this very sort of like computationally academic explanation of like, well, it's just compute minutes. So we'll parallelize the jobs, and then like you gotta just figure, I don't know how your test suite works. You have to take these things and make it parallel. And it struck me as like something that we could just advertise better and publish more guidance on like, here's a good way to do it. And like, if that means we put some syntax sugar on it to make it feel like, you know, GitLab, make it go faster. Like that'd be great. And running fewer tests to me falls kind of in the same category. But it's like, it seems like a hard qualitative decision about which test is important, right? Like what is the cost and value of a given test, right? Like there are expensive tests that you want to run all the time because they're just super duper important. And then prioritizing that, I don't think there's a way for us to ever automatically do that for a customer because it's so preference based. But if we can start documenting the way we do it and trying to just declare that it's the best practice because it's the way we do it, and here we are being a company, I think we can get a lot of mileage out of that with customers who just sort of get to this open-ended place and they're like, I want to run fewer tests, and like I read this blog post, I don't know what to do now. That I think if we write some like forceful opinions in our documentation, I think that's great. We'll just tell people like, yeah, don't run feature specs. Just, and like you can if you want, and we'll have a whole aside, you know, but like our thing that we declare is that you just don't do it. Our customers seem to like that. So I think if we get opinionated about the tools we already have, I think we can get a lot of good feedback on that, and it'll help customers like know what they want to do because it's not really articulated. And we've had a whole team spend like an engineering initiative amount of time figuring out like, what do we care about? So let's assume that everybody else cares exactly the same way and just tell them.
Thanks, Drew. Kyle, what are the tools that we use to determine which specs to run? Is that like
it's not a secret sauce, it's all open source stuff. So
okay.
like with Ruby, we use Crystal Ball. We essentially generate a mapping every 2 hours that says these files relate to these specs, and then we consume that mapping to say run those specs based on the changed number of the changed files until first approval on the pipeline. With Jest, which is what we're looking towards next, there's a built-in find related test features that does a lot of that has a lot of intelligence built into it on looking at load paths and things like that. I imagine there's something similar, but this, I agree with you, Drew. Like this is not like there's one solution for everything. It's almost like a language by language by language challenge. But the general capabilities there. I did have one question for you on Circle CI. So does Circle CI, do they auto determine the number of parallel builds to execute? Because like for us, we have to manually maintain it and monitor it to say, oh, we've added X number of tests, we maybe need to bump our builds.
I would have to check. I don't know that.
So I think there was an issue in the direction page that James linked on this, or it was in the deck that said to auto determine that number. That would be a huge win, but that doesn't save minutes, that saves duration. So like you can shorten your total time to feedback, which is very, very important, but at the expense of CI minutes. Because if you throw like 10 more machines at running your RSpec tests, you're essentially having 10 times the number of, like in the end, it's probably the same number of minutes and you're just accelerating feedback. But there is some startup time and things like that that we see in our own pipelines where
I don't think we have the level of introspection to know like how much of your job was load time and how much is in your script. That would be really cool, and we could like plot a chart of like, here's your CI optimality where you're getting the shortest duration without spending too much setup time.
I'm getting hung up on the details of what I'm saying. Like, what would be cool is just to know, like, your test cases have gone to this level, and you should, like, almost like a nudge in the UI could be like, you should consider using parallel.
Yeah. So I guess my thing was, I don't know how to programmatically tell the difference between a job that runs like 100,000 short tests and one very long test. Right. We just know that this thing ran for 2 hours. I mean, and this could be a language by language thing and a tool by tool thing where we can detect some cases and say, oh, we think this would be a good time to do it and suggest it. But I'm not sure how to say that definitively.
Yeah. I was just thinking, like, even in the test report. So again, I'm going to get to implementation, and this is stupid. You can see how many total tests were run by suite. Usually those suites correlate to a CI job. Like our unit test is at 79,351 in this example that I'm looking at. We have, I think, 25 concurrent builds that we split that out amongst. In the UI, it might just be nice to say like, hey, you've exceeded X threshold. You should consider and look and see if their pipeline configuration is not using parallel. You should consider using it. And it's almost like a nudge to say, you can get faster feedback by doing this.
Oh yeah, if the test report's there with all the timings, then yeah. Absolutely.
But they have to be using it. So like, that's the thing, is they'd have to be using the
Right.
test report to get that information. That was just something that came to mind.
Yeah, no, and I mean, that's a great, it's a great carrot to like, if you start using this other feature, you'll get this other feature for free kind of thing. That is, there's some kind of good cycle there.
Yeah. Yeah, are you looking at the duration and the total number of like I think it's total duration. It has to be, because that's 337,914 seconds. That's 600 minutes. So, if they're using test report, there might be a way to start that intelligence of here's where you can optimize your pipeline just with that data. But one of the things I heard from you, and I think this resonates with stuff that James has said before, people more care about duration than minutes, because they can always self-host runners. They can always solve the minutes challenge on their own. Is that a fair summary?
I say that's fairly accurate, but I mean, he's my cheap self, but I would also care about CI minutes.
Yeah.
You're not venture funded.
This maybe comes back to just doing a recording where words on a page and out of my mouth aren't doing the selective test execution stuff justice. So like a 3-minute video of recording, like, here's a pipeline before, here's a pipeline after, here's the savings in duration and minutes that we see. I think would help kind of bring some context to that effort. That would be beneficial way beyond this anyways. I've been talking with Albert to consider doing that.
Yeah, no, I think that idea is very useful. I'm just not sure the best way to go about. I'm always jumping into implementation ideas, but yeah, I'm not sure what the best customer solution would be. Whether that is just documentation, heavy documentation of like examples. We do that elsewhere. Or if it's some kind of helpful built-in feature that they can opt into to help determine that mapping and then running the suite. You said the mapping takes like 2 hours or like every 2 hours you do the mapping.
Yeah.
Where is that happening? Is that just like?
We have a scheduled pipeline that happens in, and that's Ruby specific. Jest and I think front end in general. So like JavaScript would be a different thing.
Got it. So you're running a pipeline, a scheduled pipeline, and then it updates the monorepo with the mapping.
It stores it in an artifact or on pages. Like we used to store it in pages until we had problems with that. But it makes it publicly available for the MR pipelines to consume and use.
Got it. Okay, so it's not stored in a repo or anything. It's just somewhere. Good. Is there like some problem of just generating it on the fly in the pipeline, like before you run tests?
It would add probably like 30 minutes in front of the time to start a test.
Got it. Okay, sounds good.
Maybe more than that. I don't recall how long it takes, but early on it was, I think 30 to 40 minutes.
Okay.
I view like that selective test execution as like an end stage goal towards giving customers better feedback of here's how to optimize your pipelines. Like that's like this is a feature where we can auto optimize or like give you more control over the tests, like running less tests. But as we were talking about it, it just made me think more about the nudges that we could provide in the product and things like that. I think that's maybe a better path to go down if you're interested in moving this forward. And Drew, like you said with the test report, it's almost like if you feed data into the test report, we can give you all of these nudges on how you can better optimize your tests. That would also grow MAU if you're using, like if you're measuring test report MAU, you know?
Yeah.
That's a good point. Yeah, we just switched over to Gmail. We had our own PG MAU thing that we were doing. Cool. Was there anything else we want to bring up? We can end this meeting a little bit early.
Not for me. I appreciate the time, and it's always a fun meeting. Sorry if it's just me talking.
No, even if it was just you, we would still hold this meeting, Kyle.
That's too bad. It should be a recording, Matt. Like I should just record it and be like, hey, these are the things that I'm saying.
These are the things
just
I
like
want.
you talked about. Like that's interesting feedback. Like that's really good feedback to think about how I can do that more ahead of the next one. And use something that's a short way to tee up any discussion.
Yeah, I find these really interesting because you're viewing our features in an entirely different perspective. We get lost in the caught up in the weeds. And it's nice to see like a bigger picture. Hey, these are the actual problems that we are dealing with as a team. It's nice. Anyway, thanks for taking the time out today. Sure, this will be put on the Google Drive sometime. But everyone have a good day.
Thank you all. Thanks for the time.